Okay, hello everybody. I'm really sorry I can't be with you in person, but hopefully these recorded lessons will be just as useful. Sorry you can't see my face, but I got a bit confused by the technology, so I thought this is just better if you can just see my slides and my writing. I've provided you with printouts of a student version of these presentations, so you can write notes on that. And at the end of the units, there is a big A3 mind map that I made with like statements to put in the right places as like a summary. So as I go through these lessons, it might be a nice idea to kind of pause when I ask a question, discuss, write it down, retrieve, have a guess, and then unpause the video and see whether you're right. If you think that's going to be doable. Okay, so first question, who's this guy? So pause the video now. Okay, did you get it right? He is, of course, Charles Darwin, very famous in biology, and words that should come into your mind immediately are evolution and natural selection. And I'm going to put by natural selection because evolution is a theory. Yeah, spelled that wrong, natural selection. Evolution is a theory, and natural selection is the process that causes the theory, that causes the outcome. So the outcome is evolution, the process is natural selection. Okay, actually, sorry, I should go back. So there are two topics we're going to be going through, which is CT 5.1, core topic 5.1, which is evidence for evolution, and core topic 5.2, which is natural selection. I'm kind of going to go over them one after the other, but they really kind of mesh together. They're very, very interrelated, so I'll be referring to bits in each topic as we go along. So let's start with 5.1, evidence for evolution. Okay, if the whole of the Earth's history was 24 hours, it's actually about 4.5 billion years, but imagine those 4.5 billion years were just 24 hours. How long do you think humans have been on the Earth for? Now, we think we're so successful. We think we're like the most successful species that's ever lived. But actually, maybe we are in terms of number, but we're definitely not in terms of how long we've been around. And I don't think we're going to be around as long as we think. So pause and have a go. How many minutes or hours or seconds do you think humans have been around for if the whole of the 4.5 billion years was only 24 hours? Let's have a look. So this is a representation of the 24 hours. So if we started at like a midnight, we go through the early hours of the morning, we get to 6 a.m, we get to 9 a.m, and there's still no life. Okay, it's all white over here, there's nothing. And then we get life. Now you can link this back to CT 1.5, which is the origin of cells. And remember, we learnt about Luca, last universal common ancestor. So he would have been about here. When I say he, obviously he was a unicellular prokaryote, so he wouldn't have had a gender. But anyway, so this is when life began. We think it was about 3.5 billion years ago. And then we come through to noon. And at noon, we've got, actually scrap that, because that arrow is in the wrong place, isn't it? And then we come around to midday, and life is still evolving. But look, we've got no fossils at this point. And that kind of makes sense, because if you look at the organisms over here, they're really soft and squishy, okay? They're just cells, they're bunches of cells, but they don't have any hard bits to them. And that's one of the things that makes a good fossil. Okay, then we've got some more fossils as we move round. And we're coming around to midnight now. And then we're coming into some more multicellular organisms, and you sort of know the sequence. We've got the fish coming in then, and then we've got the amphibians, we've got the reptiles, the dinosaurs, which incidentally were around for years in our 24-hour history of the world, and then humans 2 seconds before midnight. Okay, so we've really not been here very long, and there's been an amazing variety of life before us, and well, maybe there will, maybe there won't be after us. We seem to be destroying a lot of it. But the forms have diversified. We've got more and more species as we've gone on, and also existing species have changed over time. You can watch that this video another time. It's a really nice 10-minute video, David Attenborough going through the tree of life, so looking at what happened since Luca. Okay, so we need to define evolution. IB have a 3-point definition for evolution that I think you should always do. So it is the cumulative change in the heritable characteristics of a population. So there's 3 parts here. Cumulative means bit by bit, little by little, lots of tiny changes that add up over time to make a big change. That's what cumulative means. So evolution doesn't happen by, well, we don't think it happened by a big leap, by one generation looking one way and the next generation looking completely different. We think that there were subtle changes that you couldn't even notice between the generations. And then obviously, if you looked at maybe 1,000 generations and you looked at the difference between the population you started with and the one you finished with, you would clearly see the change that occurred over time. So cumulative changes add up over time, tiny changes, okay? Secondly, we've got heritable, and that means that the characteristics that you are looking at must be written in DNA. They must be in the genes. And obviously, if something is written in your DNA, then it can be passed on to the next generation. If it's not written in your DNA, we call it something called an acquired characteristic, not a heritable one. And those are just things that you get. Like if I go to the gym and do loads of weights and get really, really muscly, I'm not going to have really, really muscly children. That's an acquired characteristic. So heritable characteristics. So cumulative change, tiny changes add up over time. In the heritable characteristics, that's characteristics that are written into genes, that have genes that control them, of a population. And we looked at the definition of population the other day. So you have to remember what population is. It's obviously a group of individuals of the same species, living in the same area and interbreeding. We talked about that when we were talking about gene pools and speciation, talking about how does one species become more than one. So that links into that topic as well. This links into that topic. So it's all useful for you. They've got to be interbreeding because obviously for this heritable bit, changes must be passed on in your genes. If you're not interbreeding, then that's not going to happen. So population, the changes must occur within an interbreeding group that are of the same species. And that's evolution. Process of cumulative change in the heritable characteristics of a population. Okay, so we looked in gene pools and speciation, so you already know what speciation means, and it is that new species can be formed. Now, they don't come out of nothing. You kind of have one species that for some reason there's some kind of barrier. Remember, it could be geographical, it could be behavioural, it could be temporal, and then you end up with those not being able to interbreed anymore, and then gradually it separates, and then the two populations evolve separately because they have different selection pressures on them, and they'll end up looking really different. So speciation is the prevention of breeding. That's what I'm trying to show by this line down the middle here. So if two organisms are of different species to each other, it means they can no longer interbreed to produce fertile offspring. The fertile offspring is quite important as well. And remember, again, going back to topic 3, when we talked about genes and chromosomes, you know that gene number, gene location, gene locus, gene mapping, chromosome number, those are all characteristics of a species, and that's what makes them able to interbreed. Okay, so those 3 keywords, try and bear those in mind. Try and remember those when you're going to come up with a definition of what evolution is. Okay, so we now need to just explain what could cause evolution. Okay, so what could cause allele frequencies to change in a population over time, which would cause characteristics to look different? And again, we touched on this when we were doing 10.3. We touched on why this might happen. And we said that if a population was perfectly adapted for its environment already, then we probably wouldn't see much natural selection. It probably would just look the same over time. I mean, there might be minor changes from one generation to the next, but that's always going to happen. But we wouldn't see a gradual increase or a gradual decrease. We'd have a nice sort of stable gene pool. But evolution requires that there are changes over time. And so the first reason this could happen is natural selection. So I'm going to just go over that one. So natural selection, remember, is actually covered, it's got its whole own topic, CT5.2, and so we will not talk about that too much at the moment, but suffice it to say that the giraffe example is classic, that the original giraffe's population, remember, has to be a population, okay? Remember, evolution cannot happen to an individual. Doesn't work that way. Individuals live or die or move somewhere else. They can't evolve, but it's populations that can evolve. So one generation looking slightly different to the next generation, but single organisms, no, that's a really common misconception. So when I start with the giraffe example, I would need to say that there was variation in neck length of the population. And don't worry about writing this down now, because like I said, we'll go through it in natural selection. So there was variation in neck length of the original population. So this one, imagine this was like 100, that's supposed to show the original population. But the average neck length was fairly short. So you can talk about the population average. And then let's say there was, I don't know, a change in climate which caused the trees to grow taller, and suddenly a lot of the leaves were up really high, and that's what they eat. And so obviously remember, we had a normal distribution in neck length. There was an average, which was fairly short, but we had a normal distribution. So suddenly only the giraffes with the longer neck lengths are going to be able to get leaves and eat and survive. And then all the other giraffes with the average and shorter neck lengths are going to die. And if you die, you don't breed. And if you don't breed, you don't pass on your genes. So that's what causes the next generation to have a slightly longer average neck length. And it just continues and continues and continues until, if we look at it, I don't know, thousands of generations down the line, we now have a population of giraffes with an average neck length that is far, far longer. But there is still going to be a normal distribution. But I'm not going to talk about that too much. It's got its own topic. So the other two, which I will touch upon when I do 5.2, but note them down now because I'm not going to talk about them again. Number 2 is genetic drift. This can cause evolution. So if you look over into this picture here, we have what we call an ancestral population living on an island, and these are butterflies. And the characteristic we're looking at is obviously butterfly colour. And let's assume it's a fairly stable population. There aren't really any changes in sort of average colour frequencies from one generation to the next. But then look what happens. A few of those butterflies, only 3, somehow get to another island where there aren't any of that species. Now, this could be a freak storm. They love the whole freak storm example. How did they get there? Oh, a freak storm. Or, I don't know, maybe humans came along and they took a ride on a boat. Whatever, they managed to get to another island. But the idea is that they're too far away to breed with the ancestral population. And these are very, very few here, and there's no white. Now, white might be recessive, we don't know, but if white isn't recessive, maybe none of those butterflies have white alleles, or white might be recessive and there might be a few white alleles, but they're going to be less than there were in the ancestral population. So when these guys breed, these are going to end up producing a new population, which there may not be any whites at all, or where there might be very few whites, a lot of blacks, and maybe a medium number of oranges. And so suddenly that population has different allele frequencies to the ancestral. This graph down the bottom here shows the same thing. There is what we call a bottleneck event. Like a bottleneck is like really narrow. So if I draw a bottle, really bad bottle, but the neck of the bottle is really narrow. So like if you pour stuff out, it has to squeeze through a tiny gap. So the idea of a bottleneck event is something that causes only a few individuals of that population to either survive or go somewhere else or whatever. But then those few individuals become the founders of the next generation. And it's actually also referred to as the founder effect. The founder effect is if a few migrating individuals establish a new colony, a new population, then you're likely to get a very different genetic makeup in the subsequent population. Or founders could go to the other island, and because there's not very many of them, as they may not be suited, they could die. And if that happens, obviously you'll get extinction. So the population is at a very delicate phase when there's only a few of them. So that can cause fairly rapid evolution, actually. Or if there was a stable population in the original environment, that can cause evolution in the new environment. And then we've got gene flow. So gene flow is when you have two populations, or more, I suppose, two populations, but they have to be of the same species. Okay. So this example at the bottom here is we've got a mountain with bird species, with one bird species either side. Notice it's population A and population B. They're the same species, but obviously very different genetic makeup. I mean, probably not all blue and all red, but different phenotypes, different characteristics. And normally the mountain is preventing breeding. Remember, breeding is really important for natural selection. And so there won't be any alleles that are being introduced from one population into the other. They'll be completely separate. But again, who knows what it is that causes one or couple of individuals to end up being close enough to the other population to breed with them. But if this happens, then there can be what we call gene flow between the two populations. So genes from one population can influence the other one. I think we were talking about this in 10.3 when we were talking about emigration and immigration. Emigration being individuals leaving a population and immigration being individuals coming into a population. And obviously, if they have a different genetic makeup, they can influence. Okay, so those are three things that can cause evolution. Natural selection is by far the top. Okay, that'll be the main one. If you have a question, that's you go to. But if it is a geneticsy question, or if it's written a bit differently so that it's asking more about the sort of founder effect and gene flow, then you want to go for those. Okay, moving on. So I quite like this diagram because I can actually tell you about both of the topics on one diagram. This is called a evolutionary tree. And it's a bit like a graph, but you can't see the axes. Basically, from bottom to top is like time. So time's moving forwards. So again, you can imagine we've got maybe, let's do like a really simple organism down the bottom. I don't know, yeah, let's draw my shell. That's probably a good idea. Like an ammonite, if anyone's ever been fossil hunting. So that's your original organism. And if the line is going straight up, indicates characteristics are remaining exactly the same. Genetic equilibrium. Obviously, that means there's no selection pressure. There's no reason why any organisms in the population would be more likely to breed than others. That's what causes there to be a change, if some are more likely to breed than others. And then what happens is we've got this split, okay? This is a speciation event, okay? This is when one species becomes two. We have a branch point on the tree. What can cause speciation? Well, anything that prevents two parts of the original population from breeding. And then obviously they've got to be prevented from breeding. They've got to be in different environments. And then we can see the lines are going diagonally now. And I like to think of the diagonal lines showing changes in characteristics. So we can show our ammonite, you know, when they were first separated, they will look quite similar. But maybe in this one, we ended up, I don't know, what could happen? Maybe the shell became kind of longer, and then maybe it kind of fused a bit and got a few wiggly bits coming out the front. And then maybe it sort of thought, well, it's a good idea if I have some sense organs here. Maybe it got a segment, you know, and then maybe we have it more segmented over here. And then, I don't know. But then maybe the one on this side did something different. I have to think about how it could differently evolve now. So I've gone for like a woodlousey thing on the left-hand side, haven't I? I don't know. Maybe the environment didn't require so much of a shell. So maybe on this side, gradually the shell is sort of reducing and the soft organism on the inside is kind of, you know, coming out a bit more. We've got a very little shell. And then we've got our sort of, I don't know, maybe it has kind of And then maybe the shell's almost gone completely, and it's just got some appendages which are developing little feely hairs. I don't know, you get the idea, but tiny changes, one generation to the next, almost imperceptible. And then what you're going to end up with at the very top of the tree is all the different species that are currently alive. So in this case, it's 7. And they'll look very different from each other, but they will have all come from a common ancestor. Remember, that's a really, really key phrase in these units, a common ancestor. Now, the common ancestor for all of them would have been this one down here. But the common ancestor for A and B would have been this one here. The last common ancestor of C and E, or why don't you pause and say, where would the last common ancestor of C and E be? Did you guess? It's going to be here, because that's the last time C and E shared and the lines came together. Where would the last common ancestor of E and G be? Pause. Okay, let's see if you got it right. It'll be here. Okay, so last common ancestors, how long ago they are, and normally, you know, if we have a look here, that's sort of a bit of time, but that's a longer bit of time. And the more time there has been since the last common ancestor for the pairing that you're looking at, the more differences you'll probably see in their characteristics. And remember, these characteristics could be stuff we can see, but also now we have lots of technology, and now we also look at differences between base sequence, between amino acid sequence in proteins. So those can be used to look at differences as well, not just physical differences. So which part of the tree shows evolution? Well, if the lines are going diagonally, that shows that a species is changing. But remember, evolution is the cumulative change in the heritable characteristics of a population. So actually evolution, by that definition, doesn't require the splits, it just requires that the species doesn't stay the same. So all of these diagonalness is evolution occurring. Which part of the tree shows natural selection? Again, if the species is changing due to a selection pressure in the environment, then natural selection will be occurring. Speciation, well, that is whenever you have a branch point on the tree. That is a speciation event. So here we have a branch point here. So the last common ancestor of C and D was here, and something stopped 2 parts of the population from breeding, and then we got 2 separate species, which may be in different environments and have different pressures on them, so could develop differently. So we talked about common ancestors, that's fine. So where do fossils come into it all? Well, fossils are part of our evidence, which we're going to look at in a bit. So basically, the only thing we can actually see alive now is the top, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. That's the thing that's alive. None of the stuff on the diagonal lines is alive anymore, so we don't know about it. We're just making assumptions from the evidence that we have. And the first evidence I will go through with you in a minute is fossils. It's the biggest bit of evidence for evolution. And so what we find is when we dig down through rock layers, we can find remains of organisms that have once lived that look similar to maybe modern day species, but they're not going to be the same because that's why they're extinct. And again, the further down you go, the more, the more differences you see, as long as the rocks haven't been upturned by like tectonic activity or anything. So fossils are part of our evidence, and we could actually place fossils along these grey lines if they were found. There might be gaps where you haven't found any, but it's almost like a bit of a puzzle where you're just trying to you're looking at all these fossils and you're like, well, which order would they go in? Right, let's look at the first tiny change. Yep, that looks right. Next tiny change. Yep, that looks right. So they help us to sort of actually put these together. So whenever you're comparing fossils, and this is a tip for exams as well, you should always talk about there being similarities and there being differences. And I'll show you some of those in a minute. So how could we show extinction on this tree? Well, remember, if time goes from bottom to top, anything that gets to the top is not extinct. But actually sometimes on the evolutionary tree, one line of the tree just is not very successful. It's just not cutting it in its environment. Think of species that are now extinct. the dodo, the giant sloth, the saber-toothed tiger, the mammoth. Unfortunately, those guys didn't last, so their line stopped. And if it goes extinct, the line is going to stop. And you don't have this one, but I hope you can see, look, if I go backwards and forwards, what's happened to line E? It's shortened. So E is no longer a current modern species. E obviously became extinct sometime before the modern day, and we'll show that by the line ending. Okie doke. Right, so that's kind of the introductory bit. So we're going to go into the evidence for evolution. So I've got, let's check, 1, 2, 3. And you can look at this on your slides. It's the ones that I've coloured with like the yellow background. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hang on, I think I may have missed out 4. Well, I got 6 evidences for evolution here, but we'll see how we go. So I think I once watched this very bad film, which is why I put this in. There's a film, I think it might be just called Evolution, I'm not sure, but it's like a comedy, quite a terrible film. But yeah, that emoji, that smiley face is kind of the icon, one of the icons they use. So what is the evidence for evolution? Okay, remember though, in science, when we talk about the word theory, doesn't mean the same as theory does in English. In science, it means we currently believe this to be true. We currently do not have any evidence against this. Therefore, it is the working, I suppose it's the working, accepted status quo. And evolution is that. We are going with what we've got already. So let's dive into the evidence. So first evidence is fossils. Okay, and as I was explaining to you before, we can sort of look through rocks, sedimentary rocks, because you need sediment to make fossils. So we can look down through sedimentary rocks, do some digging, do some archaeology, and we can find preserved remains of organisms that had once lived, which is basically a fossil. There's a bit more to add to it than that, but and what you should be able to see is sort of intermediate forms between what once was and what now is. And remember, those intermediate forms represent, because as I'm going through these evidences, I want you to look back constantly to the definition for evolution, because we're showing how these provide evidence for evolution. So the fossils are showing almost those tiny cumulative changes. If the fossil has been preserved at that point in time, we should be able to see a tiny change from the previous one. And these are going through some of the geological epochs and eras and things, like Pleistocene, Cretaceous, Silurian, Archean. Archean, remember? Archaea is one of the 3 domains in classification. Life has only really been around for about 3.5 billion years, maybe a bit less. Earth, 4.5 billion years. But fossils are one of our major pieces of evidence. And we can generally say the lower down you go, the older the fossil, but that's not always true, because obviously tectonic plates sometimes upend bits of rock and the strata gets a bit mixed up. So what is a fossil? So I said it was the remains of an organism that had once lived, or that lived a long time ago, but I'm going to add in this word petrified. I love this word. And Harry Potter fans, it doesn't mean the same as it means in Harry Potter. Harry Potter, petrified was when people just didn't move. They were almost paralysed. Petrified means turned to stone. Now, I'm ashamed to say that I used to believe that fossils were actually bones, but they're not. You know, like if there was a dinosaur bone, I just thought it was a preserved dinosaur bone, but they're not. They are petrified remains. So it looks like a bone, it's the right shape of a bone, but it's not a bone. It's petrified. It has been turned to stone, and we're going to talk about how that process occurs. How do we get an organism dying and parts of it ending up as stone, literal stone? And depending on where the organism dies, it has an influence on what kind of stone or rock or, what was I going to call it? Like a mineral, that it actually turns into. Okay, so just a bit of background about fossils. So about the oldest fossils we've got are roughly when we think life began, and they don't really look like organisms. Like these sort of swirly bits, this is not an organism. These are just like kind of almost, I suppose you can think of them as like bacterial colonies or something, you know, just the shape that has been left in the rock after the sediment, which was obviously deposited at the bottom of a river or something, with the organisms in it. So these are of cyanobacteria, so in Western Australia, so really, really old. But like I said, multicellular organisms, chordata, again, think of your classification. We are chordates, aren't we? Animals with a backbone. Fish are as well, but they were the first chordates to evolve. So how old are the oldest fish? Well, they're about 500 million years, so 500 million. So again, relatively recently, and this is a pretty awful looking fish, but it does have a head with sense organs, it does have gill, and it does have a sort of a stiffened rod in its back. So look at this question at the bottom. Are there any fossils that look like modern day organisms? That's an important question. And actually the answer should be no, there are not, because actually modern day organisms should be different because of the cumulative changes. So again, there might be similarities, but you're not going to have any fossils that look like modern day organisms, because that's not the point of evolution. Otherwise they wouldn't be here now. Okay. How are fossils made? So we have a picture here of a mammoth. Now this is an unusual fossil actually. This is not a classic fossil. It's not a petrified one, this one at the top here. This mammoth, where's my pen gone? My pen's not working. Oh, there we go. No, it's not working. There we go. Okay. So this is actually a preserved mammoth. It hasn't decayed. This is the actual organism. It looks a tiny bit shriveled, but actually all being told it's in pretty good nick. And the reason it hasn't decayed is because one or more of the factors required for decomposition were absent. So you should know that decomposition is, and let's just write here, little decomposition. So it's actually preserved. You should know that decomposition is done by bacteria and fungi, and that they require water, temperature, a suitable temperature, and the presence of oxygen. So if this was like in the ice, obviously the temperature was literally just too cold for the enzymes to work, for their metabolism in the microorganisms, so they couldn't break it down. Or obviously all the water was unavailable because it was locked up. So you get some fossils like that where the decay is prevented, or there isn't any decay. And that would be because of what I've said, one or more of the conditions required for decay is absent. So that is your water, oxygen. Well, the lower school way of remembering it is WOW, isn't it? Water, oxygen and warmth. But we don't really want to say warmth. We want to say a suitable temperature because of enzymes. Remember, in biology, whenever there's something to do with temperature, you can make an educated guess that they want to say something about enzymes. Okay, let's have a look at the bottom picture then. So we've got a sequence of events, and it's supposed to show time going from left to right. So picture number 1, organism dies. Okay, dinosaur has died. Crucially, where has it died? It has died in a river. Fossilization occurs far, far, far better in rivers, the sea, bogs, anything like that. And the reason again is because decay is slowed down in these environments, okay? Because you don't want the whole thing to decay before it gets buried. It's very key for fossilization that the organism is buried by sediment, okay? And you're more likely to be buried by sediment if you die in an aquatic environment. So number 1, organism dies. Number 2, we can see we've now only got the bones, and that's because the bacteria and the fungi have decomposed, have broken down the soft parts of the organism. Now that happens very quickly, it's very easy to decompose. But while this is going on, mud, silt, sand, etc. is being deposited on the bottom of the river. And so gradually it's sort of burying the dinosaur. And what we want for a fossil to form is we want the burial, because we don't want, if eventually the bones do actually break down after a very long time. but they stay around for long enough if they're covered up for what we call mineralization to occur. Okay, so we've got soft parts decaying. It's buried in sediment, number 3, very important. And then as it's buried in sediment, again, depending on which rock type it's been buried in, there will be mineral ions in that rock around. Well, it won't be rock at that point, it'll still be fairly soft. But there'll be mineral ions. There'll be different mineral ions in different parts, different rocks, different geographical locations. And so what we need to say is, as the hard parts are decaying very, very slowly, mineral ions seep in and replace the hard parts. So you're replacing the bone with minerals, and depending on where it is, those minerals will be different. And so when we look in picture number 4, this is now not bone anymore, this is now stone, and depending on what stone it is. And you can get some beautiful ones. If you have a look, you can get fossils that look golden, that look like a rainbow colour, that look quartzy and shiny and white and red, and they're lovely depending on what minerals have seeped in to replace the bone. So number 4, as I said, as hard parts decay very slowly, minerals seep in and replace them. And that's it, the fossil is formed. And obviously the last picture here shows humans excavating that particular area and discovering the fossilized parts of the organism. So that's how fossils are made. Let's move on. So obviously we're talking about how can they be evidence for evolution. Keep that in your mind. So how do humans use fossils as evidence for evolution? I think my animations are a little bit off here, but anyway, we'll do the bottom part first. We can actually do carbon dating of, well, not just carbon dating, actually, we can use different radioisotopes, different elements, and we can actually work out how old the fossil is from looking at that. So this graph here is showing the half-lives, and it's obviously on the x-axis you've got 20,000 years, which sounds long, but not when we're talking about 3.5 billion. But anyway, so it's giving you how much is going to be left. So you've got this radioactive carbon atom, and what it does is as it goes through radioactive decay, it becomes nitrogen-14. So carbon-14 actually becomes nitrogen-14. And so you measure the amount of carbon-14 left, and that tells you how old the organism is, because this decay process happens at a very fixed rate for each type of radioactive isotope. So if you look at the total amount that was there to begin with, the time it takes to go from the total amount to 50% of what was left is 5,730 years. That's one half-life. So you've halved the amount. You've gone from 1 to half, or 100% to 50%. So if you pick up a fossil, then you can use that to date it. And then if we go to another half-life, we don't half what we had to start with, but we half what we've got then. So you half the 50 and you get to 25% or a quarter. You're going to have to add on another 5,730 years, which leads you to 11,460, and so on and so on and so on. And you get this curve which is created. Now, different radioactive isotopes have different half-lives, and actually carbon's one is not that long, especially when we want to measure millions of years. So sometimes we have to use different ones. And as you can see at the bottom here, the half-life of potassium-40 is 1.3 billion years as it radioactively decays into argon-40. So basically, if you had, I don't know, X amount of potassium-40 in something, 1.3 billion years later, you will have half X. You'll have half the amount you had to start with. Okay, so the half-life of a fossil, the fossil can be sampled and we can test the half-lives, and that can tell us how old it is. And the other thing is what I was saying before, similarities and differences. So this is some human skulls or hominid skulls from H to N. And we've got front views and side views. And what we want to look for is similarities and differences. And so if we take the two at the very end, if we take this one and this one, there's a big difference. if you just cover over the ones in the middle for the moment and just look, the big differences are, I would say, the size of the cranium, the volume of the cranium, it's far, far bigger, and the brow ridge, the sticky outy bit of bone. So if you didn't look at these intermediate forms and you just looked at modern day and the first one that was ever found, it would look like there was a big change. And you wouldn't know whether that big change had happened all at once or gradually. But because we have the intermediate forms, we can see these gradual changes over time. And again, from the front view, you can see, you might be able to see other changes as well. But normally what we would do is we would just compare, one to the next, and then that one to that one, and then that one to that one. And we would look at the similarities between them. And you would state the similarities, and then you would also state the differences. So obviously they're all hominid skulls. They all have 2 eye sockets, a nose socket. They all have an upper jaw. They all have a cranium. It's all laid out the similar way. There are 2 eyes. They're at the front. But there are differences, and that would be talking about the brow ridge and maybe the cranium volume. Okay, and then the other thing over here is the fossil record. So again, if we've got our rocks, newest rocks at the top, oldest rocks at the bottom, we're not actually lucky enough to find organisms in every layer. Sometimes the conditions just weren't right for fossilization. Sometimes they've been destroyed. Sometimes they weren't formed in the first place because the organisms were too soft. So sometimes we have a complete lack of fossils in one part, and this can be different. So my arrow's in the way, and I've not screen recorded on PowerPoint 4, so I'm not going to move that arrow. But so continuous fossil records are rare. What we usually say is there are gaps in the fossil record. And there are gaps because, as I said, 3 reasons. 1, they may have been destroyed. They could have been destroyed by tectonic activity, volcanic activity. They could have been destroyed by humans. They could have been not formed in the first place because the conditions weren't right, because maybe there was complete decay, because maybe it wasn't somewhere where it was sedimented. Maybe they didn't form in the first place because the organism was too soft. So we got destroyed, not formed in the first place, or we just haven't found them yet. We haven't found all the fossils. We've not digged in every rock. Who knows what we might find. That's like one of the really exciting things. So not found them yet, not formed in the first place, or destroyed. Okay, so that is how we use fossils. So as a final bit on fossils, if you just have a look at this question and see if you can work it out, it's a bit of maths, a bit of application, and then so I've now been talking for about 45 minutes, so I'd imagine we've done a lesson now. So I'm going to stop and leave you with that problem, and I will see you next time.